Hello, I'm Ben, and you're watching The PhD Parent. As reviewed in another video, there's evidence showing that timeout from positive reinforcement is an effective approach for reducing behavioral problems in kids. Now, if I were a parent, and I am, and I wanted to use timeout from positive reinforcement with my kid, a question I might ask is, what is the most effective way to do so? And the answer to that question is the focus of the current video. So researchers have distinguished 7 different parameters of timeout from positive reinforcement that can vary. It's actually 8, but the 8th one, whether you should use something to signal the beginning or end of timeout, has apparently never been researched, so I'm leaving it out. But here are the other 7. First, whether a reason for timeout is given. Second, whether a warning is given. Third, how the child enters timeout, for example, verbally instructed versus physically taken by the parent. Fourth, the location of timeout. Fifth, how frequently timeout is used, all the time versus some of the time. Number 6, whether the end of timeout is contingent on some behavior. And 7th, duration of timeout. Now, Caroleo have saved me plenty of time because they've already reviewed research conducted across the past 30 years or so, which has investigated what works best in terms of each of these parameters. So I'll just summarize what they found. So if you want to save yourself time, the research doesn't provide any clear answers. So first of all, should you give a reason for why timeout is being administered? So Caroleo found 2 studies that have investigated whether giving a reason to a child concerning why they're in timeout makes a difference to its effectiveness. In the 2 studies reviewed, neither found evidence that giving a reason for timeout made any difference. However, both studies had small sample sizes. That is, one had 4 kids and the other had 32 kids across 4 conditions. Thus, while the findings don't suggest that giving a reason for timeout makes a difference to its effectiveness, the studies didn't have sufficiently large samples to detect a difference should one exist. In statistical terms, they're not adequately powered. Hence, there's not enough research evidence to say whether giving a reason makes a difference to the effectiveness of timeout. Next, should you give a warning before administering timeout? 4 studies this time. Roberts found that giving a warning versus not giving a warning did not have a differential impact on kid compliance with parental requests. And the same result was reported by Velasquez in siblings who were fighting each other. Jones found that not giving a warning was better than 2 warnings prior to timeout in terms of reducing fighting. And lastly, Twyman had slightly complicated results, but suggested if anything that warnings were not helpful. However, these studies again had very small to small sample sizes, 24, 3, 3 and 9 respectively. Thus, there's really no good research evidence to say whether giving a warning makes a difference to the effectiveness of timeout. So now on to, should you tell your child to go into timeout or should you physically take them? Caroleo suggests that one study by Donaldson has looked at whether you're better off telling your child to go into timeout versus physically putting them in timeout. But having read this study myself, it didn't actually involve directly comparing these 2 approaches. So I would say there are no studies that have looked at this issue. But for the sake of interest, what Donaldson did was compare a timeout procedure in which kids could reduce the duration of timeout from 4 minutes to 1 minute if they took themselves there when instructed versus a timeout procedure in which they had to stay in timeout for 4 minutes, irrespective of whether they took themselves there when instructed. Incidentally, there were no differences between the 2 conditions in terms of impact on problem behaviors. So the study didn't involve a clean test of the alternative approaches and again could be criticized on the basis of a very small sample size with only 6 kids. Thus, we don't have any good research evidence to know what the best way to get kids into timeout is. Now, what's the best location for timeout? According to Caroleo, 3 studies have looked at what location is best for timeout, commonly comparing a separate room from where the problematic behavior occurred versus a chair in the same room as where the problem behavior occurred. Rather than go through each study, I'll just say that the studies only involved between 1 to 3 kids. So while not wanting to sound like a broken record, because the sample sizes are so small in these studies, there's no good research evidence to say what the best location is for delivering timeout. Now on to how frequently should timeout be used. For their review, Caroleo found 11 studies that investigated how often timeout should be administered in response to problematic behaviors. The conclusion they drew from these studies was that it's best to start with a continuous schedule of timeout, that is, delivering timeout on every instance a problematic behavior occurs. Then once the problematic behavior is no longer happening as often, you can consider switching to an intermittent schedule of timeout. For example, delivering timeout every 2nd to 4th time a problematic behavior occurs. However, the evidence upon which this conclusion has been drawn is, in my view, a little sketchy. Specifically, one of the studies was about the impact of electric shocks on the behavior of pigeons. 2 studies involved college students being given timeout when they stuffed up a task within the lab, and the remaining 8 studies were mostly case studies of one individual. Some involved adolescents or adults rather than kids, The participant was usually in a treatment or residential facility with timeout being administered by a therapist or similar, and in most studies, the participant was in a facility because they had very low IQ. Thus, there are several problems with these studies, including small sample sizes, a reliance on case study designs as opposed to more rigorous randomized control trials, participants who are not kids, and in one case not humans, a large number of studies that focused on individuals with profound intellectual deficits, which limits the generalization of results, studies that do not consider the kinds of problematic behaviors that parents would administer timeout in response to, an obvious example being stuffing up a lab task, timeouts not being delivered by parents, and studies not taking place in the home environment. So, I don't reckon the results of these studies provide a strong base upon which to draw conclusions about how often parents should administer timeout. So now on to how should timeout end. The approaches researchers have investigated when it comes to how timeout should end fall into two categories. The first category is contingent release. So following a fixed amount of time, for example 2 minutes, the end of timeout requires the kid to behave in a specified way. Most commonly, the child must be quiet for a certain amount of time, for example 15 seconds. So for example, if they're going to be in timeout for 2 minutes, then they have to be quiet from the 1 minute 45 second mark to the completion of 2 minutes. And prior to that, they can, in principle, just let it rip. The second category is non-contingent release, where timeout ends after a fixed amount of time. Caroleo reviewed 8 studies investigating contingent versus non-contingent release. And they concluded that because there was no evidence showing that contingent release was more effective than non-contingent release, in 6 of the 8 studies, the latter approach is the better one to go with as it's more straightforward to implement. Probably a reasonable conclusion, but again, one problem is that many studies had very small samples, for example, between 3 to 16 participants. As mentioned, with such small samples, you're not in a good position to adequately test whether there's a difference between contingent versus non-contingent release. There were 2 studies with slightly larger samples that Caroleo considered, although these still had some issues. So Fabiano recruited 71 kids, but the issue with this study is that in the contingent release condition, kids had to be quiet in the first half of timeout rather than later in timeout, and compliance with this rule enabled them to be released early from timeout. Thus, while the study involved a contingent release condition, it didn't fit with the definition of contingent release. That is, what a kid needs to do for timeout to end following a fixed period, and so is not relevant to the discussion. If anything, this study would address the issue of whether incentivizing kids to get out of timeout before a specified time period is reached is a more effective way of administering timeout than not incentivizing kids. The other study was by Erford and involved 36 kids who were assigned to one of 3 conditions: contingent release versus non-contingent release versus control. This study found support for the idea that contingent release is more effective than non-contingent release. However, the contingent release protocol was a bit complicated, in that kids were given 7 timeout rules, and if they broke any of them, timeout was extended for 1 minute. The study also highlights a different issue. That is, if you're going to use contingent release, what's the optimal punishment for not complying with conditions for release? It may be the case that evidence for the benefit of contingent release is dependent upon the punishment for trying to leave early. So, in summary, only the Erford study really gets close to providing reliable information about whether contingent release is a more effective way of administering timeout than non-contingent release. But this is only one study, and it still falls into the category of small sample size. Hence, I don't reckon the reviewed studies provide a strong base upon which to draw conclusions about how timeout should end. So next we'll look at the duration of timeout. So Caroleo included 11 studies and drew 3 conclusions. Timeout should be 5 minutes or less. Timeouts 10 minutes or longer do not add any benefits over shorter timeouts. And it's not a good idea to start the long timeout duration and then shorten it. I'm sounding like a broken record. I don't reckon the research evidence permits any such conclusions. Now, Caroleo reviewed a study by Kapelka and Brick, but I couldn't get my hands on the paper despite my best efforts. And the information provided by Caroleo wasn't sufficient to have a good idea of what went on in the study. It involved contrasting 2 versus 4 minute timeout to boys diagnosed with ADHD. From what I can tell, there was no difference between the 2 conditions. At any rate, I'm going to skip this study. 4 of the reviewed studies had very small sample sizes, less than 7 participants, and so the results of these studies are not all that informative. One of the studies, by James, involved 45 adolescents and adults who stuttered and were being given timeout in order to try and improve their speech fluency. I don't consider this study to be relevant to the issue of parents using timeout to improve behavioral problems in their child. Then there was a study involving administering timeout with durations of 1, 15 or 30 minutes to 20 kids aged 7 to 21 years old who were institutionalized due to very low IQ. A study involving administering timeout with durations of 15, 30, 45, 60, or 90 minutes to 13 kids aged 9 to 17 years old who were in a psychiatric hospital. The duration of these timeouts is a bit ridiculous, I would have thought. Another study that involved administering timeout with durations of 1, 5, 10, and 20 minutes to 20 kids who were also in a psychiatric hospital. And a study that involved administering timeout with durations of 5 and 30 minutes to 30 adolescent male delinquents. Again, I reckon it's a bit of a stretch for the findings of these studies to be considered relevant to the issue of parents using timeout to improve behavioral problems in their child. And as Correleo pointed out, there is an ethical issue in some of the studies concerning the use of such long periods of timeout, which renders their findings redundant. That is, if 60 minutes was found to be an effective duration for timeout, I can't imagine many folks would consider that appropriate. The only study that did involve parents and kids was Hobbs. In this study, the researchers recruited 28 kids who were assigned to one of 4 conditions. The conditions were 4-minute timeouts versus 1-minute timeout versus 10-second timeout versus control. The outcome the researchers were interested in was child compliance with parental requests. To cut a long story short, the 4-minute timeout was found to be more effective than the 1 or 10-second timeout, and 1 minute was more effective than the 10-second timeout in terms of increasing kids' compliance with parental requests. So this is the only study worth focusing on. But you might be able to guess what I'm going to say. It's a study with a small sample, and it's only one study. Thus, I don't reckon there's enough research evidence to say what's best in terms of the duration of timeout. I will say that parenting experts typically recommend an upper limit of 3 to 5 minutes for timeout. So in summary, the research evidence does not provide a clear answer to the question, what is the best approach for putting timeout into action? In this situation, the next best thing to do is to turn to expert opinion, which is what I cover in another video on the basics of parenting interventions. And you can check out that video in the link below. But for the moment, that's it for the evidence supporting the best practice implementation of timeout and positive reinforcement. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.